My dad stole my college scholarship money and threatened to kill himself because I was angry. I said, go ahead. All right, so here's how it all started. I'm in my first year of college, right? Feeling like I've made it. Like I'm on track to get my life together and do something decent. I worked hard as hell in high school, got a full ride scholarship to this university, and even had my housing covered. It felt like a dream, you know? Except that dream went up in flames because of my dad. So, to give you some background, I come from a pretty messed up family situation. My dad? Well, he's been unemployed for as long as I can remember. Literally decades. He's always working on something or waiting for the right opportunity. But the truth is, he just doesn't feel like working. My mom's not much better, but we'll get into that later. Right now, it's all about what he did to screw me over. I get this check every semester for about $9,000 to cover my dorm fees. It's all part of my scholarship package, and it's supposed to go toward my housing. I never even see the money because it gets sent straight to my home address, where I don't live anymore. I didn't really think much of it because my dad told me he'd handle it. I was naive, like really naive. I guess part of me wanted to believe he'd step up for once, you know? Well, I should have known better. So about a couple months into the semester, I get this email from my college saying my dorm fees still haven't been paid. I'm confused, obviously, because I thought my dad had already taken care of it. I'm stressing out, thinking it's some sort of clerical error, and I start trying to figure out what's going on. I call my dad and ask him what's up with the housing payment. He gives me some runaround story about funds being hard to access, which honestly didn't make any sense to me. But at the time, I didn't know much about how all this financial stuff worked, so I let it go. Stupid, I know. Weeks go by, and I'm still getting these warning emails from the housing office. If the payment doesn't get made soon, I could get kicked out of my dorm. I'm barely sleeping, barely eating, just straight up anxious 24/7. All I could think was, what if I lose my spot in college over this? I worked so hard to get here, and it felt like it was slipping out of my hands all because my dad couldn't get his act together. Finally, I call him again, more desperate this time. I'm practically begging him to pay off my dorm fees before I get kicked out. That's when he drops the bomb on me. He used the $9,000 for the hotel. I'm like, what hotel? And then it hits me. You see, my dad, my mom, and my younger siblings had been living in a hotel for the past few months because they got evicted from our old house. I didn't think much of it before because, frankly, I had my own stuff going on with school and everything. But now, it all made sense. My dad had taken my scholarship money meant to pay for my housing, and used it to pay for the hotel they were staying in. He didn't even tell me. At this point, I'm fuming. I asked him why he didn't tell me earlier, and his excuse was that he didn't want to stress me out. Like what? You think I'm not already stressed out knowing that I could lose my spot at college because you couldn't pay the bill? I told him I worked my ass off in high school to get here and that it wasn't fair he was risking my education for his own mistakes. And you know what he said? He blamed me. He said it was my fault because I wasn't helping the family enough. Can you believe that? He even had the nerve to say that he was providing for the family by using my scholarship check. Like, dude, you've been unemployed for over 20 years. How is this providing for anyone? And then to top it all off, he gave me this half-assed apology, like he was doing me a favor. I asked him, flat out, if he was sorry for what he did, and he said sorry, but in this sarcastic, mocking tone that made it clear he didn't mean it at all. I lost it. I told him he was full of crap and that he'd ruined everything. That's when he pulled his usual stunt, threatening to kill himself. Now, I'm not trying to sound cold, but this wasn't the first time he'd done this. Anytime I push back on anything, he pulls the "I'm gonna kill myself" card to make me feel guilty. Normally, I'd back down and apologize just to keep the peace, but not this time. I was too angry. I told him straight up to go ahead and do it. And then I hung up. After that, I felt a weird mix of guilt and relief. Like, I didn't want to be that harsh, but at the same time, I couldn't take the manipulation anymore. The man had stolen my scholarship money and then turned it around to make me feel like the bad guy. I wasn't going to let him guilt trip me into apologizing for being upset. Later that day, my mom called me, and of course, she was siding with him. She said I needed to apologize to my dad, that I was being disrespectful, and that I should have understood his situation. I was like, what situation? He stole my money and lied to me about it. But she kept pushing, telling me that if I didn't apologize, she'd cut me off from the family. At that point, I was exhausted. I hadn't been eating or sleeping well, I was behind in my schoolwork, and now I had my mom threatening to disown me. So I did what I always do in these situations. I backed down. I told her I'd apologize just to keep the peace, but deep down I wasn't sorry at all. The whole situation had me questioning everything. Like, How did I end up in a position where I had to apologize for being angry that my dad stole from me? It felt so twisted. But that's just how things were in my family. My dad was always the victim, and my mom was always there to back him up, no matter how bad things got. Anyway, that's where things stood. I was stuck, my housing still wasn't paid for, and I was left trying to figure out what to do next. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't trust my dad with anything anymore. But even then, I couldn't fully break away. Not yet. So after that mess with my dad using my scholarship money, things were tense as hell between us. I was still at school, trying to keep up with my classes, but it was hard. I mean, how could I focus when I didn't even know if I'd have a place to live in a few weeks? Every day I was getting more and more emails from the housing office, and I kept having to make excuses about why the payment hadn't gone through yet. All the while, my dad is over here acting like he's done nothing wrong. He kept promising that he'd get the money together, saying he was working on it, and that I needed to stop worrying. But how could I not worry? The deadline was creeping up fast, and I couldn't just sit around hoping he'd magically come through. Thanksgiving break was coming up, and I was dreading going back home. I didn't even want to see my dad after everything that had happened, but I didn't really have a choice. It was either go home or stay in the dorms alone, and honestly, I didn't want to spend the holiday by myself. I figured I'd just go home, keep my head down, and avoid any big arguments. When I got there, things were super awkward right away. My dad was pretending like nothing had happened, trying to act all friendly, but I wasn't having it. I could feel this weird tension between us, like we were both waiting for the other one to snap. My mom, on the other hand, was doing her usual thing of playing peacekeeper, trying to brush everything under the rug. She kept telling me, "Just let it go. It's Thanksgiving. Don't start anything." But I was still pissed. At dinner, we all sat around the table, and I could barely eat. Every bite felt heavy, like I was swallowing a rock. My dad kept trying to make small talk, asking me about school and how my classes were going, like he actually cared. I gave short answers, trying to just get through the meal without blowing up. But then he brought up the scholarship money, and that's when I lost it. He casually mentioned how he'd figured it all out and would have the money by the weekend. I couldn't help it. I laughed, like really laughed, because I'd heard that line so many times by now that it was almost funny. Almost. "Sure, you'll have it by the weekend," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just like you've had it for the last 2 months, right?" My dad's face dropped, and he got defensive immediately. He started going on about how hard things had been for the family, how I didn't understand the pressure he was under. The same crap he always pulled, but I wasn't going to let him guilt-trip me again. "You stole my money," I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was hard. "That was for my dorm, and you spent it on yourself. Now I'm the one who's going to get kicked out because of you." He didn't like that. He started raising his voice, saying how he did what he had to do for the family, and that I should be grateful for everything he's done. Grateful? For what? For lying to me? For stealing from me? My mom jumped in, trying to calm things down, but it was too late. I couldn't hold back anymore. "You're always doing this," I shouted, standing up from the table. "You take, and then make it everyone else's problem when you screw up. I'm done, Dad. I'm done covering for you." He sat there, stunned for a second, but then he did what he always does. He turned it back on me. "You're being ungrateful," he said, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I've sacrificed so much for this family, and this is how you repay me? By throwing it in my face?" I couldn't even look at him anymore. I was so angry that my whole body was shaking. I turned to my mom, hoping she'd at least back me up, but she just gave me this tired look, like she was disappointed in me for causing a scene. "You need to apologize to your father," she said quietly, like she was talking to a little kid. "He's doing his best." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Apologize? To him? After everything? "No," I said, my voice low but firm. "I'm not apologizing. Not this time." And with that, I walked away from the table, grabbed my coat, and left the house. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get out of there. I walked around the block a few times, trying to cool down, but the anger wouldn't leave. It just kept building up inside me, like this weight I couldn't shake. After a while, I headed back to the house because, honestly, I didn't have anywhere else to go. When I got inside, the table was cleared, and my parents were sitting in the living room, not saying a word. I went straight to my room and shut the door, trying to block out everything. Later that night, my dad came into my room. He didn't knock, just walked in like he always does. He stood there for a moment, looking at me like he was about to say something important. But then, he didn't. Instead, he started in with the same line he'd been using for months. "I'll have the money by Saturday," he said, his voice soft like he was trying to make peace. "You just have to trust me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was too tired. Mentally, physically, emotionally. I just nodded, knowing full well that I didn't believe a word he was saying. After he left, I laid there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling this overwhelming sense of defeat. I'd spent so long trying to fix everything, trying to keep the peace and hold my family together, but it felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. They always found a way to make me feel like the bad guy, like I was the one who needed to apologize. But I was done. Done apologizing, done pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, constantly walking on eggshells around my parents, hoping they'd change when deep down, I knew they wouldn't. That was the moment it hit me. Nothing was going to change unless I made it change. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep going down the same road anymore. Something had to give, and for the first time in a long time, I realized it was going to have to be me. So, after Thanksgiving, I went back to school, and honestly, I was just trying to keep my head down. I didn't really talk to my parents much after that fight during dinner. Things were awkward, to say the least. My dad still hadn't paid the housing fees, and I kept getting those emails from the housing office. The deadline was way past, and I was still holding on to this slim hope that he'd actually come through like he said he would. But deep down, I knew better. The last straw came a couple weeks later when I got a notice saying if my dorm fees weren't paid by the end of the week, I'd be forced to leave. That was it. The panic really set in then. I was barely hanging on in my classes. And now I had this cloud hanging over me, wondering if I'd be homeless on top of everything else. I didn't know what to do. Like, what was I supposed to do? I'd already asked my dad 100 times, and I knew he'd just keep making excuses. I tried calling him again, one last time, just to give him a chance. But of course, it was the same old story. He claimed the money was coming soon, maybe by the weekend, maybe early next week. I could tell by his voice that he didn't have it, and he wasn't going to have it. He kept throwing around excuses like, "It's harder than you think," and "I'm doing my best." But honestly, I was sick of hearing it. I didn't even bother arguing anymore. I just hung up and sat there staring at the wall, trying to figure out what my next move was. That's when I realized I couldn't keep waiting around for him to fix things. He wasn't going to. He never had. I was on my own. I had to figure this out myself, or risk losing everything I'd worked for. I had no idea where to start, but the first thing that popped into my head was talking to the financial aid office at my school. Maybe they could help me out, give me a loan or something to cover the housing until I could figure out what to do next. It felt like a long shot, but I didn't have any other options. So I made an appointment and explained everything to the financial aid officer. I told them about how my dad had taken my scholarship check and spent it on something else, leaving me with nothing to pay for my dorm. The woman I spoke to was really understanding, but I could tell even she was struggling to figure out how to help me. She said something about emergency bursaries, but the amount wouldn't cover the full cost, and there were no guarantees. She also asked if I'd thought about reporting what my dad had done since, technically, he had committed fraud. She didn't say it outright, but I could tell she thought I should turn him in. And honestly, a part of me wanted to. Like, how could he do this to his own kid and not feel any remorse? It felt so wrong, and I was angry enough that I almost considered it. But then I remembered what that would mean for my mom and siblings. If my dad got in trouble, the fallout wouldn't just hit him. My mom, who's not even a citizen, would probably get deported, and my little brothers would be left with no one. It's messed up, right? My dad's the one who screwed me over, but I couldn't do anything about it because my whole family would end up paying for his mistakes. So, I told the financial aid officer I couldn't go down that road. She understood but said there wasn't much more they could do. I left the office feeling worse than before, like I'd hit a dead end. A few days later, I was sitting in my dorm, staring at the eviction notice I'd gotten, when I got a text from my sister, Lisa. Now, Lisa and I hadn't talked in a while. Our relationship was pretty strained because of our parents, mostly because my dad had treated her like garbage too. But I guess she'd heard what was going on and wanted to check in. She asked how I was doing, and I told her everything, just kind of venting. I didn't expect much, but she ended up being way more supportive than I thought. She told me about how our dad had screwed her over too, back when she was in college. Apparently, he'd maxed out her credit cards and left her with a mountain of debt, which she'd been paying off for years. She said she had to drop out because of it, and that's why she ended up cutting ties with him and mom. It felt weird hearing her side of things. I mean, I knew our dad was a mess, but I didn't realize just how bad it had been for her. It was like this dark family secret no one had ever talked about. The more we talked, the more I realized we had both been through the same thing. We were both victims of our dad's lies and manipulations. Lisa told me that cutting them off had been the best thing she ever did, even though it had been hard at first. She said she felt freer than she ever had, and even though she wasn't in the best financial shape, at least she didn't have them controlling her life anymore. I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness after our conversation. On the one hand, I finally had someone in my family who understood what I was going through. On the other, it made me realize how deeply screwed up my family was. I mean, if Lisa had gone through all this before me and no one had done anything about it, what chance did I have? But at the same time, it gave me a little bit of hope. If Lisa had managed to pull herself out of the mess, maybe I could too. Maybe I didn't need to rely on my parents anymore. Maybe it was time to start figuring things out for myself. After that conversation, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for my dad to pay the housing fees. I wasn't going to let him keep dragging me down. I started looking for part-time jobs around campus, something I could do while keeping up with my classes. It wasn't easy, and the pay wasn't great, but it was a step in the right direction. I also started talking to Lisa more. We hadn't been close in years, but reconnecting with her felt like finding a lifeline in the middle of everything. She gave me advice on how to budget, how to handle the student loans I'd probably have to take out, and just general life stuff. It was nice having someone to lean on, someone who had been through the same thing and come out the other side. I still hadn't figured out how I was going to pay off the dorm fees, but at least I wasn't sitting around waiting for my dad to fix it anymore. I was taking control, little by little, and it felt good. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely helpless. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I had to keep pushing forward. I couldn't let my dad's mistakes define my future. It was time to move on and start figuring out what kind of life I wanted without relying on anyone else to make it happen. After talking to Lisa and realizing I wasn't alone in all this, I felt like I had some clarity. I wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but at least I wasn't waiting around for my dad to do something he clearly had no intention of doing. I got myself a part-time job on campus working at one of the dining halls. It wasn't glamorous or anything, but it paid enough to cover my essentials and at least kept me afloat for the time being. The thing is, even though I was trying to move forward, it still felt like I had this massive weight on my chest. Like my parents were still in the background, messing with my head, and I couldn't fully shake them off. My dad would text me every once in a while, usually with some lame excuse about why he still hadn't gotten the money. He'd promise again and again that he'd get it soon, or that he was working on it. But I learned not to hold my breath. At one point, he actually had the nerve to call me up and say he could have paid the housing fees, but he was waiting on a better deal. Like, what? A better deal on what? A last-minute miracle? I didn't even know how to respond, so I just let him ramble on, tuning out halfway through his speech. It was always the same thing, a whole bunch of nothing. Meanwhile, my mom was still trying to play peacemaker, acting like I should be grateful that my dad was even trying at all. She'd call me up, tell me I needed to give him more credit, and then hit me with a guilt trip about how hard things were for the family. But that was her thing, right? Defending him, even when he was clearly in the wrong. I guess she didn't know any other way. Anyway, as the semester went on, I managed to scrape together enough for my job and some savings to make a partial payment toward my dorm. It wasn't enough to clear the whole balance, but it was something, and at least it bought me some more time before I got kicked out. I was juggling work and school, barely getting enough sleep, but I was managing. I guess you could say I was in survival mode. One night, I was sitting in my dorm, exhausted from my shift at the dining hall, when I got another text from my dad. This one was different, though. It wasn't his usual excuses or empty promises. Instead, it was short and to the point. Need your help. Call me. At first, I was tempted to ignore it. I mean, after everything, why would I even consider helping him? But curiosity got the better of me, so I called him back, half expecting another round of BS. When he answered, he sounded off. Not his usual fake confident self. He sounded nervous, maybe even desperate. I asked him what was going on, and he launched into this story about how he'd gotten in over his head with some debts he hadn't mentioned before. He said he was being hounded by creditors and that if he didn't pay up soon, things were going to get ugly. I didn't know what to say. Like, this was classic my dad behavior. Digging himself into a hole and then expecting someone else to pull him out. But even still, I felt this tug. Despite everything, he was still my dad, and a part of me didn't want to see him completely crash and burn. But at the same time, I was so done with his nonsense. I couldn't believe he was asking me for help when he hadn't even been able to help me with my own situation. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked him, not really sure where this was going. "I need you to help me," he said, his voice shaky. I'm out of options here. I don't know what else to do. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything he'd put me through, now he wanted me to bail him out? I can't help you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm barely holding things together as it is. He didn't like that. He started going on about how he was my father and how it was my responsibility to help the family. Same old guilt-tripping tactics, but this time they weren't working on me. I told him I wasn't going to get dragged into his mess, not anymore. He got quiet for a second, and then he said something that really threw me. If you don't help me, I'm going to lose everything, he said, his voice almost a whisper. And your mother. She'll be the one who pays for it. That hit me like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly what he was doing, pulling my mom into it like that. He knew I still cared about her, and he was using that to try and manipulate me. I could feel my anger boiling up again, but I kept it in check. That's not on me, I told him. You've made your choices. I'm not going to bail you out. Before he could say anything else, I hung up. My hands were shaking, and I could feel this mix of anger and guilt swirling inside me. I knew I'd done the right thing by refusing to help him, but it didn't make it any easier. I felt like I was caught in this never-ending cycle of trying to break free from my parents, only to have them pull me back in with their drama. The next few days were rough. I couldn't stop thinking about that phone call, wondering if I'd made the right choice. I knew logically that it wasn't my responsibility to fix my dad's problems, but the guilt was still there. My mom was stuck in that mess too, and no matter how much I tried to distance myself, it felt like I was abandoning her. But then I talked to Lisa again. I told her about the call, about how our dad was trying to guilt me into helping him. She didn't hesitate for a second. You did the right thing, she said firmly. He's using you, just like he used me. Don't let him drag you down with him. Hearing her say that was exactly what I needed. It was like a weight lifted off my chest, even if just a little. I wasn't alone in this. Lisa had been through it too, and she was living proof that it was possible to get out and stay out. That's when I realized I had to set boundaries. I couldn't keep letting my parents pull me into their mess every time things went wrong. It was time to start looking out for myself, even if it meant distancing myself from them more than I already had. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way I was going to survive this. So I made a decision that night. From now on, I wasn't going to let my dad's problems become my problems. I'd help where I could, sure, but I wasn't going to sacrifice my own future for the sake of his mistakes. It was time to start building a life for myself, without all the chaos they brought into it. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was on the right path. After I made that decision to cut myself off from my dad's mess, things didn't magically get better. But I did feel like a weight had been lifted off me. For once, I wasn't waiting on him to do something or trying to clean up his disasters. I had my own problems, sure. My dorm fees still weren't fully paid, and I was struggling to balance school and my job. But at least I knew where I stood. I wasn't tied to his promises anymore. That was something. But of course, my dad wasn't about to let me go that easily. It didn't take long before he tried to pull me back in. It started with texts, little guilt-trippy messages about how things were falling apart, how the family needed me, how I was being selfish for not helping. I ignored them at first. I had already made up my mind not to get sucked back in, and I didn't need his drama on top of everything else I was dealing with. Then one day my mom called. I hadn't really talked to her much since everything went down. She usually only called to defend my dad or to tell me I needed to apologize for whatever reason. But this time her tone was different. She wasn't yelling or guilt-tripping me. She just sounded tired, like really worn out. I knew things at home weren't great. My dad had his debts piling up and they were still living in that hotel, but I guess I hadn't realized how bad it had gotten. My mom said they were on the verge of losing the room, that they didn't have enough money to stay there much longer. She said they were running out of options and didn't know what to do. The thing is, I felt bad for her. I really did. I could hear it in her voice how desperate she was. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another way for my dad to get me to cave. He knew I cared about my mom, and he was using her to get to me. It was hard, though, because I didn't want to leave her in that situation. I didn't want my brothers to suffer because of the choices my dad had made. I told her I couldn't help financially, that I was barely making it myself. I could tell she was disappointed, but she didn't push like she usually did. Instead, she asked if I could come home for the weekend just to talk. She said my dad wouldn't be there, that he was off dealing with his debts or whatever, and she just wanted to see me. I agreed, mostly because I felt guilty. I figured maybe I could help in some other way, even if it wasn't with money. When I got home, it was even worse than I expected. The hotel they were staying at was this rundown place, way out on the edge of town. The room was cramped, with my mom, my two younger brothers, and their stuff all crammed into this tiny space. It smelled like old carpet and mildew, and there were stacks of papers and bills scattered around. My mom looked exhausted. She'd always been this strong, put-together person in my mind, but seeing her like that, it really hit me. We sat down to talk, and she told me more about what had been going on. My dad's debts were bigger than I thought, and he wasn't making any progress in paying them off. He'd been borrowing money from anyone he could, including some family members who weren't exactly happy about it. The whole situation was spiraling out of control, and my mom was just trying to hold everything together. But then she said something that really threw me. She asked if I could take in my younger brothers for a little while, just until they got back on their feet. She said it would be temporary, just a couple of months, but that they needed some stability, and right now they weren't getting it. I sat there stunned. I hadn't expected that at all. I mean, I love my brothers, but I'm in no position to take care of anyone right now. I'm barely taking care of myself. I'm still living in a dorm, working a part-time job to pay my own bills, and now she wanted me to be responsible for 2 kids? I didn't even know what to say. I don't know if I can do that, I told her, trying to be gentle about it. I'm not in a place where I can take care of them. I barely have enough for myself. She nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her face. I understand, she said quietly, but I knew it wasn't what she wanted to hear. I just don't know what else to do. We sat in silence for a while after that. I could tell she felt trapped, and honestly, I felt guilty for not being able to help more. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't take on that kind of responsibility. I wasn't equipped for it, and I didn't want to end up resenting them for something that wasn't their fault. Before I left, I told my mom I'd help however I could, but I couldn't take my brothers in. I offered to help her look for other options, maybe find some kind of assistance program or something, but I could tell she wasn't hopeful. She thanked me for coming, but I could see it in her eyes. She felt like I was letting her down. Driving back to school, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole situation. I kept going back and forth in my head, wondering if I'd made the right decision. On one hand, I knew I couldn't realistically take in my brothers. I wasn't in a stable enough place for that. But on the other hand, they were my family. How could I just leave them in that situation? I called Lisa when I got back to my dorm. I told her everything that had happened, and like always, she was straight with me. "You did what you had to do," she said. "You can't save everyone, and you can't set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Trust me, I've been there. It's not your job to fix their mess." She was right. I knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. I guess part of me still felt like I owed them something, even after everything. It's hard to shake that feeling, you know? Like, they're still my family, and as messed up as everything is, I still care about them. But Lisa was right. I couldn't let myself get dragged down by their problems. I had to start looking out for myself, or I'd end up in the same position they were in. And that was the last thing I wanted. The next few weeks, I focused on getting through the semester. I put my head down, went to work, studied as much as I could, and just tried to stay on track. My grades weren't great, but they weren't terrible either. I was getting by, and for now, that was enough. I still felt guilty about my mom and my brothers, but I knew there was only so much I could do. I had to draw the line somewhere, or I'd never be able to break free. It was hard, but I kept reminding myself that it wasn't my job to fix everything. And maybe, just maybe, I was starting to figure out how to move forward without them pulling me back down. As the semester went on, things kind of settled into this weird routine. I was still working at the dining hall, scraping by with the money I made from that, and trying to keep up with my classes. My grades were better, but not where they should have been. Honestly, I was just exhausted all the time. Between working, studying, and the stress of everything happening with my family, I felt like I was just in survival mode. My dad kept sending me texts here and there asking for updates on my life, and sometimes dropping hints that they were still struggling. It was always the same, how they needed a little help, how things would get better soon. But I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to let myself get pulled back into their mess. I'd told him no enough times that the guilt was starting to wear off. I guess when you hear the same sob story over and over, it just loses its power. One weekend, out of nowhere, my dad called me again. I debated answering, but figured it would be better to just get it over with. When I picked up, his voice was tense. He told me that he and my mom had been fighting nonstop, and she had finally had enough. She'd left the hotel with my younger brothers and gone to stay with a friend. He made it sound like it was some huge betrayal, like she was abandoning the family. But I couldn't help but feel relieved. I knew she was in a toxic situation, and if this meant she was finally standing up for herself, maybe things would actually change. I didn't really know what to say though. I mean, what do you even say to that? I told him I was sorry things had gotten so bad, but I wasn't about to get sucked back into their drama. He started ranting about how she wasn't being fair, how she was overreacting, and how he was still trying to fix things. But the more he talked, the more I realized that he wasn't really upset about her leaving. He was upset that he'd lost his control over her. It's crazy, but for the first time in my life, I saw my dad for what he really was. Not just some clueless guy who'd made a few mistakes, but someone who manipulated the people around him to keep them dependent on him. And now that my mom had finally broken free, he was panicking because he didn't know how to function without her. I didn't say much during the call. I just let him rant until he finally gave up and hung up. But after that, I started thinking about everything. About how my whole life, my parents had been controlling me the same way. They'd used guilt and manipulation to keep me in line, to make me feel like I owed them something. And it worked for a long time. But now I was seeing things more clearly. I talked to Lisa about it later that night. She wasn't surprised at all. She said that's just how our dad operated. He'd done the same thing to her for years before she finally cut him off. It was weird though, because even though I was relieved my mom had left him, part of me felt guilty for not being there for her. I mean, I knew it wasn't my job to fix things, but it still felt wrong to just watch it all fall apart. Lisa, being Lisa, didn't let me sit in that guilt for too long. She reminded me that I'd done everything I could and that my mom had made her choice to stay with him for so long. It wasn't on me to rescue her, and she had to figure things out on her own. I knew she was right, but it was still hard to shake that feeling of responsibility. Over the next few weeks, things got quieter. My dad stopped calling as much, and I didn't hear much from my mom either. It felt strange, like this calm after the storm. I wasn't sure if they were still fighting or if they'd somehow patched things up. Part of me wanted to check in, but the other part of me knew I needed to keep my distance. I couldn't get sucked back into their problems again. During that time, I started focusing more on myself, on getting through my classes, figuring out my next steps, and just trying to rebuild my life outside of all the chaos. It was hard, but for the first time, I felt like I was actually in control. I wasn't waiting on anyone else to save me. I was doing it on my own. I also started seeing a counselor at school. It wasn't something I'd ever thought I'd do, but after everything that had happened, I figured it couldn't hurt to talk to someone. It was weird at first, opening up to a stranger about all the stuff I'd been through, but it actually helped a lot. The counselor helped me sort through all the guilt and frustration I'd been carrying for so long, and for the first time, I started to see things from a different perspective. She told me something that really stuck with me. You're allowed to take care of yourself first. You can't pour from an empty cup. It sounds simple, but it hit hard. I'd spent so much time worrying about my family, about what they needed, and how I could help them, that I'd completely ignored my own needs. It was time to change that. By the end of the semester, I felt like I was finally starting to find my footing again. My grades were solid, and I was even considering taking on more hours at the dining hall to save up some extra cash. I wasn't where I wanted to be yet, but I was getting there, slowly but surely. Then, one day, out of the blue, my mom called. She told me she'd left my dad for good. She'd found a place to stay with a friend, and she was figuring things out with my younger brothers. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I could hear the relief in her voice, and for the first time in a long time, she sounded free. I didn't know how to respond at first. Part of me wanted to jump in and help, to offer whatever support I could, but the other part of me knew I needed to keep my boundaries. So I told her I was proud of her for leaving, and that if she needed anything, I was here to talk. But I didn't offer more than that. I couldn't. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, just processing everything. It felt like this huge chapter of my life was finally closing. My parents were no longer the center of my world, and I wasn't responsible for fixing their problems anymore. It was a strange feeling, liberating, but also a little scary. But I knew one thing for sure. I was moving forward. My family would always be there, in some way or another, but they didn't control me anymore. I was done with that part of my life, and now it was time to focus on what came next. Whatever that was, I was ready.